At 5:34 p.m. on the 23rd of June 2001, the National Weather Service office in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, issued a tornado warning for Hamlin County. The warning was based on radar signatures indicating a strong rotation in a severe thunderstorm moving northeast at 35 miles per hour. The town of Castlewood, population 630, lay directly in the storm's path. The warning message was broadcast over NOAA weather radio and transmitted to local law enforcement and emergency management offices. Everything seemed standard. The storm had been producing large hail and damaging winds for the past hour, and the rotation on radar was tightening. Only a few minutes later, something was off. At 5:40 p.m., a trained storm spotter near the town of Estelline, about 15 miles southwest of Castlewood, reported a funnel cloud. The spotter described a rotating wall cloud with a dust swirl beneath it. The National Weather Service updated the warning, now specifying that a tornado was likely. They urged immediate action, but a funnel cloud is not the same as a tornado on the ground. The spotter watched. The funnel did not touch down immediately. It danced, retracted, then lowered again. At 5:48 p.m., the spotter radioed in tornado on the ground 1 mile west of Hamlin County Road 10. The tornado was moving northeast at about 35 miles per hour directly toward Castlewood. The warning had been issued 14 minutes earlier. The town had time, or so it seemed. At 5:52 p.m., the Hamlin County Sheriff's Office began activating the outdoor warning sirens in Castlewood. The system was manual. A deputy had to drive to the fire station to flip the switch. The sirens were old, installed in the 1980s, and their audibility depended on wind direction and the sound of the approaching storm. The deputy later stated that he heard the sirens start, but he could not confirm they were heard across the entire town. The tornado was now 6 miles southwest of Castlewood. The damage had already begun. At 5:55 p.m., the tornado struck the small unincorporated community of Wood Lake, population barely 70. It destroyed a grain elevator and toppled a set of metal storage tanks. One farmhouse was lifted off its foundation. The occupants, a family of 4, had taken shelter in their basement moments before. They survived. The tornado was now churning through open farmland, picking up soil and debris growing darker. The radar indicated a debris ball, a signature that means the tornado is lifting heavy objects into the air. The National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning for the same area, reinforcing the tornado warning. But the storm was moving fast, and the next target was Castlewood. At 6:02 p.m., the tornado entered the town limits of Castlewood from the southwest. It was a multiple-vortex tornado with several smaller funnels rotating around a central core. The winds were estimated at 200 to 220 miles per hour, placing it high on the Fujita scale in F4. The width of the damage path was 400 yards, nearly a quarter mile. The tornado stayed on the ground for the next 3 miles, cutting a swath through the southern half of town. At 6:03 p.m., it struck the Castlewood School. The building was largely empty as it was a Saturday evening, but a caretaker was inside. He heard the roar and ran to the interior hallway. The roof was ripped off. The gymnasium walls collapsed inward. The caretaker was trapped under debris for 45 minutes before rescue workers dug him out. He survived with a broken leg. At 6:05 p.m., the tornado destroyed a row of houses on Elm Street. One home was a 2-story wood-frame structure built in 1920. The house had a basement, but the homeowner, a 72-year-old retired farmer, did not have time to reach it. The house was lifted and thrown 70 feet from its foundation. The man was found in the debris field, killed instantly. He was the only fatality in Castlewood that evening. 30 other residents were injured, 3 critically. 24 homes were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The tornado continued northeast, leaving Castlewood at 6:08 p.m. and dissipating over open farmland at 6:17 p.m. after a path length of 38 miles. What happened? The immediate answer is a supercell thunderstorm that produced a strong, long-track tornado on a summer evening. But that answer does not explain why one man died while others survived, or why the warning sirens were heard by some and not by others, or why the National Weather Service had issued the warning 28 minutes before the tornado hit, yet the fatality occurred in a house that was not a mobile home, not a trailer, not an obviously vulnerable structure. The questions that surfaced in the days and weeks after the Castlewood tornado were not about the weather. They were about the systems that sit between the forecast and the people. To understand the Castlewood tornado, you have to look at the sky that afternoon. A strong upper-level low-pressure system was moving across the northern plains. South Dakota was on the warm side of that system, with moist air from the Gulf of Mexico streaming northward. At the surface, a dry line had set up across eastern South Dakota, separating the humid air to the east from the hot, dry air to the west. Along that boundary, the atmosphere was unstable. The convective available potential energy, or CAPE, was measured at over 3,000 joules per kilogram, a value that supports explosive thunderstorm growth. The wind shear was also strong. The winds at the surface were from the southeast, while winds at 20,000 feet were from the southwest, creating a helical rotation in the atmosphere. Those conditions are textbook for supercell thunderstorms. By mid-afternoon, storms began firing along the dryline near the Missouri River. One storm in particular developed near the town of Miller at around 3 p.m. It grew quickly, taking on the classic Hook Echo radar signature. By 4:30 p.m. that storm would become the Castlewood tornado. The National Weather Service office in Sioux Falls had been monitoring the situation since the morning. At 9 a.m. they issued a hazardous weather outlook, noting the potential for severe storms. By 1:30 p.m. they upgraded to a severe thunderstorm watch. At 4:15 p.m., a tornado watch was issued for parts of South Dakota and Minnesota, including Hamlin County. When the storm produced the first rotation at 5:20 p.m., the warning meteorologist on duty made the decision to issue a tornado warning based on the radar alone, before any spotter confirmation. That was the correct decision by the book. The warning was issued at 5:34 p.m., which gave Castlewood a lead time of 28 minutes. That is considered an excellent warning lead time by modern standards, but lead time is only useful if people hear the warning and act on it. The outdoor warning sirens in Castlewood were controlled by the Hamlin County Sheriff's Office. The standard procedure in 2001 was that the Sheriff's Office would activate the sirens when they received a tornado warning from the National Weather Service, but only if they also had visual confirmation of a tornado or a credible report from a spotter. In this case, the National Weather Service issued the warning at 5:34 p.m., but the first spotter report of a funnel cloud came at 5:40 p.m., and the tornado did not touch down until 5:48 p.m. The sheriff's office waited for the spotter report. The deputy drove to the fire station at 5:50 p.m. and activated the sirens manually. That meant the sirens did not begin sounding until 5:52 p.m., only 10 minutes before the tornado hit Castlewood. At that point, many residents were already outside, watching the sky. Some heard the sirens and took shelter, others did not. The investigation that followed looked closely at the siren activation delay. The National Weather Service meteorologists noted that the warning had been issued with enough time, but the sheriff's office had chosen not to activate the sirens based solely on the warning. They wanted visual confirmation. That decision was rooted in a common problem in small towns: false alarms. In previous years, sirens had been activated for funnel clouds that never touched down, leading to public complacency. The sheriff's office was trying to avoid crying wolf, but on this day the wolf was real and the delay cost time. The man who died, later identified as Arthur W. Miller, was a widower who lived alone at the south end of Elm Street. His house did not have a basement, but it had a crawl space. Neighbors reported that he was seen sitting on his front porch at 5:55 p.m. watching the storm approach. They yelled at him to take cover. He waved and went inside. The tornado struck 7 minutes later. The NWS damage survey determined that the house was not anchored to its foundation and was swept away. Mr. Miller never had a chance. His body was found in a ditch nearly 100 yards away. The coroner ruled blunt force trauma. The broader investigation into the Castlewood tornado yielded several findings. The siren system was one. The lack of a NWR or NOAA weather radio in Mr. Miller's home was another. The fact that the school's emergency plan had not included a Saturday caretaker was a third. The town had no designated storm shelter open to the public, because the school basement, which doubled as a shelter, had been locked at 5 p.m. when the janitor left. The only shelter available was in private basements, and not every house had one. The National Weather Service also looked at the warning itself. The polygon-based warnings that are common today were not yet in use in 20's Rune. Instead, the warning was issued for an entire county. That meant residents in Castlewood might have thought the warning was for someone else. The meteorologists noted that the wording of the warning did not emphasize the specific threat to Castlewood. It said Hamlin County and gave the general area. That vagueness may have reduced the sense of urgency. In the days after the tornado, the NWS survey team documented the damage path. They classified the tornado as an F4 with wind speeds between 207 and 260 miles per hour. The path was 38 miles long and up to 400 yards wide. They found evidence of extreme damage: trees debarked, vehicles thrown, a 2-ton tractor moved 150 feet, a steel telephone pole bent to the ground. The survey also identified 37 houses that were destroyed or had major damage. They interviewed over 100 residents. The pictures from the ground showed a town that looked like a war zone. But the Castlewood tornado was not the only tornado that day. It was part of a larger outbreak that produced 10 confirmed tornadoes across South Dakota and Minnesota. One of those tornadoes, an F3, struck the town of Altamont, South Dakota, killing 1 person there as well. A third tornado, an F2, injured 5 people near Clear Lake. The outbreak was the worst in the region since 1992. Yet the Castlewood tornado received the most attention, largely because of the warning delay and the single fatality that, in the judgment of some, could have been prevented. The question that investigators kept returning to was, How could a small town with a 28-minute warning still lose a life? The answer was layered. It involved the manual siren activation procedure, the preference for visual confirmation over radar data, the assumption that everyone would hear the sirens even if the wind was blowing from the wrong direction, the lack of a public shelter, the absence of a NOAA weather radio in the victim's home, and finally the personal decision of one man who, like many people in rural South Dakota, had lived through dozens of warnings and never seen a tornado touch down. The system worked, but it also failed. It worked because the warning was accurate and timely. It failed because the chain from the meteorologist to the individual citizen had weak links. The Castlewood tornado remains a case study in emergency management and risk communication. It is cited in training materials for the National Weather Service and in courses for emergency managers. It led to changes in siren activation policies in several South Dakota counties, including the adoption of radar-only activation in some jurisdictions. It also contributed to the push for more consistent use of the tornado emergency statement, which was first used in 1999, but by 2001 was still not standard in every office. The lessons were not cheap. They were paid for in the loss of one life, the injuries of 30 others, and the destruction of a small town's character. But the full story of what led to that loss of life would take weeks to uncover. The meteorological chain of events was clear. The human chain was not. The human chain was not. And that chain had many links, each one forged by routine, budget constraints, and the quiet assumptions of small-town life. In the weeks after the Castlewood tornado, investigators from the National Weather Service, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the South Dakota Office of Emergency Management sifted through every piece of the puzzle. They conducted over 100 interviews. They reviewed dispatch logs, siren activation records, phone calls to the sheriff's office, and radio transmissions. They mapped the exact location of every person who was injured or killed, and they compared those locations to the timing of the warnings. At 8 a.m. on the morning after the tornado, the search for survivors began in earnest. The debris field stretched for nearly 40 miles. The damage was not continuous. The tornado had lifted and touched down multiple times, a common behavior for violent supercell storms. In Castlewood itself, the main street was impassable. Power lines lay across the road. A grain elevator had collapsed, spilling thousands of bushels of corn into the street. The high school gymnasium had its roof torn off. A pickup truck was wrapped around a tree. The emergency responders who arrived in the first hour described a scene of surreal destruction. They found no major fires, but the sound of generators and chainsaws filled the air. The body of Arthur W. Miller was recovered at approximately 7:15 a.m. A neighbor had noticed his front porch was missing and called the sheriff. A search team found him in a drainage ditch 100 yards southeast of his home. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner listed the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries consistent with being thrown by extreme winds. The time of death was estimated at 5:58 p.m., roughly 2 minutes after the tornado struck his house. But the search for answers did not end with his recovery. Investigators turned to the question of why he had not taken shelter. His home had no basement. The crawl space under the house was accessible through a trapdoor, but it was only 18 inches high, barely enough for a person to squeeze into. The house itself was a wooden frame structure built in the 1940s with no anchor bolts connecting it to the foundation. The NWS damage survey later determined that the house was completely swept away, a classic indicator of F4 winds. The crawl space would not have saved him even if he had reached it, because the house above it was lifted and carried off, leaving the crawl space exposed. The investigators also looked at his personal history. Miller was 78 years old. He had lived alone since his wife passed away in 1997. He did not own a NOAA weather radio. His television was an older model that received only over-the-air broadcasts. On the evening of June 24th, he had been watching a baseball game on the local CBS affiliate. The game was interrupted by a severe weather bulletin at approximately 5:40 p.m. That bulletin included the tornado warning for Hamlin County. But the bulletin did not specifically mention Castlewood. It said the warning covered the entire county, and it advised residents to seek shelter. Miller apparently saw the bulletin and went outside to look at the sky. He was a farmer by background, accustomed to watching weather patterns. He had lived through dozens of severe storms. He did not believe the tornado would hit his street. That belief was not unfounded. In the previous 10 years, Hamlin County had issued tornado warnings on at least 15 separate occasions. Only one of those warnings had resulted in an actual tornado touchdown, and that tornado was a weak phone that caused minor damage. The false alarm ratio was high. The sheriff's office had activated the sirens for some of those warnings, but after a few false alarms, residents began to ignore them. A survey conducted the year before the Castlewood tornado found that only 40% of residents would take shelter immediately upon hearing a siren. The rest said they would first look outside, or call a neighbor, or wait for additional information. That survey data was known to the Hamlin County Emergency Manager, a part-time position held by a volunteer. The emergency manager had proposed purchasing a mass notification system that could call residents by telephone, but the county commission had denied the funding. The cost was estimated at $15,000. The county budget was tight. The commission decided that the existing siren system was sufficient. The siren system, installed in the 1970s, consisted of 3 sirens mounted on poles at the fire station, the school, and the water tower. They were activated by a manual switch inside the fire station. There was no remote activation capability. The deputy who activated the sirens on June 24th had to drive to the fire station from his home roughly 2 miles away, a trip that took him nearly 12 minutes from the time the warning was issued. The NWS investigation also looked at the timing of the warning itself. The warning was issued at 5:34 p.m. The first report of a funnel cloud came from a storm spotter 2 miles southwest of Castlewood at 5:40 p.m. The tornado touched down at 5:48 p.m. The NWS meteorologist who issued the warning later stated that he had considered using the term tornado emergency, a phrase reserved for situations where a confirmed tornado poses a severe threat to a populated area. He decided against it because he did not have visual confirmation. The phrase had only been used a handful of times since its creation in 1999, and there was no standardized guideline for its use. The meteorologist said he believed the warning itself was sufficient, but the warning was broadcast over the NOAA weather radio network at 5:34 p.m. Miller did not have a NOAA weather radio. The local television station interrupted the broadcast at 5:40 p.m., but Miller had already gone outside. The sirens did not sound until 5:52 p.m. By that time, the tornado was already on the ground and moving toward Castlewood at an estimated 40 miles per hour. Radar data showed that the tornado passed over the town at 5:56 p.m., exactly 4 minutes after the sirens began. Miller's house was struck at 5:58 p.m. He had no time to reach any shelter after the sirens started. The only chance he had was to have taken shelter when the warning was first issued, or when he saw the funnel cloud. The question then became, why did the sheriff's office not activate the sirens based solely on the NWS warning? The answer lies in the unofficial policy of the county. The sheriff at the time stated that the office had always required a spotter report before sounding the sirens. He believed that false alarms eroded public trust. He also noted that the NWS warning had been issued for the entire county, not specifically for Castlewood. The tornado could have touched down somewhere else. The sheriff said that in his judgment, activating the sirens for every countywide warning would cause unnecessary panic and could lead to accidents as people rushed to shelter. He defended the decision to wait for a spotter report. The NWS investigation did not assign blame, but it did recommend changes. The final report, published in August 2001, listed several findings. The primary finding was that the siren activation policy needed to be revised. The report recommended that sirens be activated immediately upon receipt of a tornado warning, regardless of visual confirmation. It also recommended that the county purchase a NOAA weather radio for every public building and encourage residents to buy one. The report noted that the town lacked a designated public shelter and that the school basement, which was used for shelter during school hours, should be accessible at all times. The report also addressed the broader issue of risk communication. It recommended that the NWS adopt more specific impact-based warnings, including the use of the tornado emergency phrase when appropriate. That recommendation would take years to fully implement, but it planted a seed. The Castlewood tornado became a case study in the importance of clear, specific warnings. It was cited in training materials for NWS forecasters as an example of how a well-issued warning can still fail if the chain of communication is broken. But the investigation dug deeper. It looked at the role of the school janitor who locked the basement door at 5 p.m. The janitor was a part-time employee who had worked at the school for 8 years. He stated that he had no knowledge of any emergency plan for weekends. He had been told to lock the school after cleaning, and he did so. The school principal said that the emergency plan was posted in the office, but it had not been updated in 3 years. It did not mention weekend procedures. The school board had not reviewed the plan since 1998. The basement door was not equipped with an emergency release that could be opened from the outside. If the door had been left unlocked or if a key had been available, residents without basements could have taken shelter there. Instead, the basement remained inaccessible. The investigation also looked at the demographic vulnerability of Castlewood. The town had a median age of 47, higher than the state average. Almost a third of the homes were built before 1950, many without basements. The elderly population was particularly at risk. Miller was not the only elderly resident who did not take shelter. Several others were caught outside or in vulnerable structures. 2 of the 30 injured were in their 70s. One of them was hospitalized with a broken hip and a concussion. The emergency medical responders noted that many of the injured were people who had waited too long before moving to safety. The meteorological analysis of the storm also revealed something else. The tornado that struck Castlewood was not a classic single-vortex tornado. It was a multiple-vortex tornado, with several smaller subvortices rotating around the main circulation. This explained the erratic damage pattern. Some houses were completely destroyed, while others 10 feet away were only lightly damaged. The multiple vortices can create sudden bursts of extreme wind that appear and disappear within seconds. That behavior makes it nearly impossible to predict exactly where the worst damage will occur. It also means that people who think they are safe because the tornado is still a block away can be caught off guard when a subvortex suddenly swings in their direction. The NWS survey team documented the damage path with GPS coordinates and photographs. They found that the tornado had produced F4 damage in 3 distinct areas: the southeast edge of Castlewood, a farmstead 2 miles north of town, and a stretch of open country near the Hamlin-Dual County line. The F4 damage was characterized by the complete removal of well-built homes from their foundations, the debarking of trees, and the scouring of soil from fields. The tornado also picked up a car and threw it into a pond where it was found submerged. The car's driver, a woman named Sharon Lund, had taken shelter in a ditch. She survived with minor injuries. In the month that followed, the town of Castlewood began to rebuild. Volunteers came from surrounding counties. The Red Cross set up a canteen in the Lutheran church. Donations poured in from across the state. The school district repaired the gymnasium roof before the start of the fall semester. The county commission approved funding for a new siren system with remote activation and backup power. They also purchased 2 NOAA weather radios for the fire station and the sheriff's office. The emergency manager position was made full-time, but the emotional toll remained. The loss of Arthur Miller was felt deeply. He was known in town as a quiet man who kept to himself but always had a wave for passers-by. His funeral was held on July 2, 2001. The pastor spoke about the randomness of the storm and the comfort of faith. The town newspaper ran a front-page story about his life, focusing on his years as a farmer and his love of baseball. The article noted that he had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, only to be killed by the weather on a summer evening. The Castlewood tornado did not change the world. It did not lead to new federal laws or massive funding shifts, but it did change a small town. It changed the way the sheriff's office operated. It changed the way the NWS communicated warnings. It changed the way meteorologists thought about the gap between a warning and a response. And it left an unanswered question that haunts every emergency manager: how many minutes should it take for a warning to become action? At 5:34 p.m. on June 24, 2001, the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Hamlin County, South Dakota. That warning was accurate, timely, and based on solid radar data. The storm that produced the tornado was well predicted. The science was correct. The human system was not. And that failure, built from a sequence of small decisions, cost one man his life. The lesson of Castlewood is that a warning is only as good as its last mile. The lesson of Castlewood is that a warning is only as good as its last mile. In the months and years after June 24, 2001, that lesson would be tested again and again, not just in South Dakota but across the entire Plains region. The National Weather Service, already aware of the problem, began to move toward a more nuanced system of communicating risk. But change in a large federal agency is slow. And for the people of Castlewood, the immediate aftermath was not about policy. It was about picking up the pieces. By 7:30 p.m. on the evening of the tornado, the Red Cross had established a shelter at the Lutheran Church on Main Street. Volunteers served sandwiches and coffee. The power was out in large parts of town, so volunteers brought flashlights and lanterns. The county emergency manager, a man named Gary Olson, coordinated search and rescue operations from the fire station. He had been on the job for less than a year. He had never faced a disaster of this scale. That night, he worked until 4 in the morning, fielding calls from worried relatives and coordinating with the National Guard. The National Guard arrived the next morning, June 25th, at 6 a.m. 24 soldiers from the 152nd Combat Engineer Battalion were deployed to help clear debris and secure damaged structures. By 8 a.m., the Hamlin County Sheriff's Office had set up a checkpoint at the south edge of town to keep out sightseers and looters. There were no reports of looting, but the sheriff wanted to prevent it. The town of 800 had become a scene of devastation, and not everyone who came to look had good intentions. The damage assessment continued through the morning. The final tally was sobering. 121 homes were damaged or destroyed. The school gymnasium had lost its roof. The grain elevator was demolished. 11 commercial buildings were damaged. The total property loss was estimated at $15 million, adjusted for inflation to the year 20's rune. That figure did not include the intangible losses: the loss of security, the loss of normalcy, the loss of a life. Arthur Miller's body had been recovered from a drainage ditch on the south side of town at approximately 6:15 p.m. on June 24th. He was pronounced dead at the scene by a county coroner. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and chest, consistent with being thrown by the tornado. He had no next of kin in town. His closest relative was a niece living in Rapid City, who was notified by phone at 9 p.m. that night. She drove to Castlewood the next day and identified his body at the county morgue. She later told the local newspaper that her uncle had been a stubborn man who never listened to warnings. She said it with sadness, not anger. The funeral was held on July 2nd at the First Lutheran Church in Castlewood. The pastor, Reverend David Hodge, gave the eulogy. He spoke about the randomness of the storm and the mystery of God's will. He mentioned that Mr. Miller had been a farmer for 60 years and had seen everything the plains could throw at him. He also mentioned that Mr. Miller had lost his wife 20 years earlier and had lived alone ever since. The church was full. Many people came who had not known him well but felt the need to pay respects. After the service, the casket was taken to the Lakeview Cemetery on a hill overlooking the town. The grave was dug by hand because the cemetery's backhoe had been damaged in the storm. In the weeks that followed, the town held several public meetings to discuss what had gone wrong. The first meeting was on July 10th at the community center. Over 200 people attended. The sheriff, Jack Hartley, stood at the front of the room and took questions. He was blunt. He admitted that he had made a decision to wait for a spotter report before activating the sirens. He said he believed at the time that it was the right call. He said he now realized it was a mistake. He apologized to the family of Arthur Miller and to the town. There was applause. Some people in the audience were forgiving, others were not. One woman stood up and asked why the sheriff had not simply activated the sirens when the NWS issued the warning. The sheriff repeated his reasoning. The woman shook her head and sat down. The meeting lasted 2 hours. The county commission, which had oversight over the sheriff's office, announced that it would review the siren activation policy. The policy had been unwritten. That was part of the problem. The commission voted to adopt a written policy stating that the sheriff's office would activate the sirens immediately upon receipt of a tornado warning from the National Weather Service, regardless of whether a spotter had confirmed a funnel cloud. The policy was approved on July 20, 2001. It also required that the sheriff's office test the sirens every Wednesday at noon, weather permitting. The old system had been tested only sporadically. The sirens themselves were also upgraded. The existing system consisted of 2 Federal Signal Model 2001 sirens, one on the water tower and one near the fire station. Both had been installed in the 1970s. The system had no backup power. When the tornado struck, the power failed, and the sirens could not have been activated even if the sheriff had decided to sound them. That was a design failure. The county commission approved funding for a new siren system with battery backup and remote activation capability. The new system was installed in October 2000. It included 3 sirens, each with a coverage radius of 1 mile. The cost was $42,000, but the siren system was only part of the problem. The other part was the public's understanding of tornado warnings. In the weeks after the storm, the NWS conducted a survey of Castlewood residents to assess their knowledge of severe weather safety. The survey was distributed through the local newspaper and collected at the post office. 137 people responded. The results were troubling. Only 40% of respondents knew what a tornado warning meant. Many confused it with a tornado watch. 20% said they did not own a NOAA weather radio. 15% said they had no safe place to shelter in their home. 6% said they would not take shelter even if they heard a warning because they did not believe the tornado would hit them. That last statistic was the hardest to accept. Arthur Miller was not the only person in Castlewood who had ignored the warning. Several neighbors later admitted that they had seen the clouds but did not think the tornado would hit the town. One man, a retired farmer named Harold Jensen, said he had been sitting on his porch watching the storm approach. He thought it would pass to the north. He only went inside when he saw debris flying. He survived by lying in his bathtub. His house was heavily damaged. He later told a reporter, "I guess I was stupid." The survey results confirmed what meteorologists already knew. Warnings are only effective if people act on them. And people act on warnings only if they understand them, trust them, and believe they are personally at risk. The National Weather Service, still stung by the Castlewood failure, began to develop a new concept: impact-based warnings. The idea was to move beyond the standard template of tornado warning for County X until time Y, and instead add specific details about the expected severity, the likely location, and the potential consequences. The phrase tornado emergency had been used informally since the 1999 Moore, Oklahoma tornado, but it was not standardized. The Castlewood tornado gave the NWS a concrete case study. They could point to a situation where a standard warning had been issued, but the lack of a specific threat statement led a sheriff to delay action and a population to underestimate the danger. In the fall of 2001, the NWS's Central Region headquarters in Kansas City held a workshop on tornado warning communication. The Castlewood tornado was one of the featured cases. The workshop brought together forecasters, emergency managers, social scientists, and broadcast meteorologists. The discussions were technical but also emotional. The NWS meteorologist who had issued the Castlewood warning, a man named David Miller, attended. He later said that he spent years replaying the events of June 24th in his head. He wondered if he could have done something differently. He had written the warning at 5:34 p.m. He had included the phrase, "This is a dangerous storm." He had mentioned the possible tornado. He had done everything by the book, and still a man died. The workshop produced a set of recommendations. One was to adopt a tiered warning system with specific wording for particularly violent storms. Another was to encourage emergency managers to activate sirens based on the warning, not on visual confirmation. A third was to improve public education about the difference between a watch and a warning. These recommendations were not implemented overnight. It took years, but the Castlewood tornado was cited in internal documents as a key motivator. Meanwhile, in Castlewood, life slowly returned to normal. The school gymnasium was repaired by September. The roof was replaced with a stronger structure. The janitor who had locked the basement door was not fired. The school board decided that the fault lay with the emergency plan, not with the employee. They updated the plan to include weekend procedures. They also installed an emergency release on the basement door so it could be opened from the outside in a crisis. The janitor, a man named Ray Keegan, continued to work at the school until his retirement in 2005. He rarely spoke about the tornado. Friends said he felt guilty even though he had followed orders. The economic impact of the tornado rippled through the community. Several small businesses closed within the year. The hardware store, which had been damaged, reopened but never regained its customer base. The grain elevator was not rebuilt. Farmers had to haul their grain to another town, adding 20 miles to each trip. Property values in the most damaged areas dropped by an average of 15%. Some families chose to move away. The town's population fell from 800 to 750 over the next 3 years. It was a slow decline, but it was real. And yet the town also showed resilience. A community fundraiser in August 2001 raised $30,000 for families who had lost their homes. A group of volunteers from a nearby church built a new house for an elderly couple whose home had been destroyed. The couple had no insurance. They had lived in the same house for 50 years. The new house was smaller, but it had a basement. They moved in on Christmas Eve 20. The local newspaper ran a photo of the couple standing in front of their new home, smiling. On the first anniversary of the tornado, June 24, 2002, the town held a memorial service at the cemetery. A small granite plaque was placed near Arthur Miller's grave. It read, "Arthur W. Miller, 1920-2001, taken by the storm." The service was brief. The sheriff spoke. He said the town had learned a hard lesson. He said they would never forget. The Reverend Hodge offered a prayer. Afterward, a group of volunteers released a dozen white balloons into the sky. They drifted south over the fields and disappeared. The second anniversary passed quietly. By the third anniversary, the town had moved on. The new siren system was tested every Wednesday at noon, and most people barely noticed. The emergency management plan was reviewed annually. The county had hired a full-time emergency manager. The NOAA weather radio in the sheriff's office was on 24 hours a day. When the next tornado warning came, and it did come on July 8, 2005, the sheriff activated the sirens immediately. The tornado touched down 4 miles east of town. No one was hurt. But the case of Castlewood was not forgotten by the meteorological community. It was included in a 2003 report by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration titled Tornado Warning Communication: Lessons Learned from Recent Events. The report analyzed several tornadoes from 1999 to 2002, including the one that struck Castlewood. The report concluded that the single most important factor in saving lives was not the technology of the warning system, but the human behavior of the people in the warning area. It noted that false alarms, while unavoidable, eroded trust. It recommended that forecasters avoid using the word possible in tornado warnings because it gave people an excuse to delay action. The Castlewood tornado also influenced the development of the enhanced Fujita scale, which was adopted in 2005. The EF scale refined damage indicators and wind speed estimates. The Castlewood damage path, with its erratic pattern from multiple vortices, was used as a training example for damage survey teams. The F4 rating assigned to the Castlewood tornado was retroactively adjusted to EF4 under the new scale, though the wind speeds were estimated to be slightly lower. In the end, the story of the Castlewood tornado is a story about the gap between science and action. The scientists did their job. The radar detected the storm. The forecasters issued the warning. The technology worked. But the human system, the chain of communication from the NWS to the sheriff, from the sheriff to the sirens, from the sirens to the people, failed at a critical link. And because of that failure, one man died who might have lived. That failure is not unique to Castlewood. It happens in every community that has ever been struck by a tornado. The question is never whether the warning was issued. The question is whether the warning was received, understood, believed, and acted upon. And that question does not have a simple answer. It depends on the sheriff, the emergency manager, the radio, the siren, the school janitor, the basement door, the elderly man who does not want to leave his home, the family that does not own a basement, the children who learn tornado safety in school but forget it during summer vacation. Castlewood was a small town in a rural county in a state where tornadoes are common. The people there knew the risks. And yet on June 24, 2001, the system broke. The investigation that followed identified the broken pieces. Some were fixed. The siren policy was changed. The emergency plan was updated. The NWS began crafting more specific warnings. But the deeper problem remains. It is the problem of human judgment in the face of uncertainty. It is the problem of rare but catastrophic events that require a response that feels disproportionate to the daily routine. It is the problem of warnings that must be taken seriously every time, even when false alarms outnumber true ones. In the years since Castlewood, the NWS has continued to evolve. The impact-based warnings that were recommended after the 2001 tornado were implemented nationwide in 2020. The tornado emergency tag is now standard. The warning polygons have been refined. The lead time for tornado warnings has increased from an average of 13 minutes in 2001 to an average of 14 minutes in 2003. That is a small improvement, but every minute matters. And yet, even with better warnings, people still die. In 2011, a massive tornado outbreak killed over 500 people across the southern United States. In 2021, a December tornado outbreak killed 89 people in Kentucky and surrounding states. In many of those deaths, the same pattern emerged. Warnings were issued, but people did not hear them, did not understand them, or did not act on them. The lesson of Castlewood is not that the system is broken. The lesson is that the system is made of people. And people are imperfect. The sheriff who hesitated was not a villain. He was a man trying to balance the risk of a false alarm with the risk of a real threat. The janitor who locked the basement door was not negligent. He was a man following a routine. The NWS forecaster who issued the warning was not incompetent. He was a professional doing his job. The victim, Arthur Miller, was not foolish. He was a man who had lived his whole life in a place where storms were common and he had always been fine. But on that evening, the numbers did not work in his favor. The storm was stronger than expected. The path was more erratic. The response was too slow. And the combination of those factors produced a tragedy that, in retrospect, could have been prevented. The Castlewood tornado now sits in the archives of the National Weather Service, one of many case files in a drawer. It is studied by meteorology students. It is cited in papers on risk communication. It is remembered by the people who lived through it, but for most of the world it is unknown. It did not become a national headline. It did not spark a congressional hearing. It did not change the law, it only changed a small town. And yet the story matters because the pattern it reveals is universal. Every tornado warning carries the same challenge. Every emergency manager faces the same decision. Every resident must make the same choice. The outcome depends on 1,000 small variables, and sometimes the variables align in the wrong way. When they do, warning systems fail. And when warning systems fail, people die. The last mile of any warning is the distance between a message and an action. That distance can be crossed in seconds, or it can stretch into eternity. In Castlewood, South Dakota, on June 24, 2001, it stretched into eternity for one man. The town rebuilt, the policies changed. The sirens were upgraded, but the memory of that evening remains. It is a reminder that the science of meteorology is not enough. The science of human behavior is just as important, and that science is still being written. The science of human behavior is still being written. But what does that mean for a town like Castlewood? It means that every warning is filtered through the personal history, trust, and physical reality of the person receiving it. And those filters can block the message even when the signal is clear. The National Weather Service has studied this problem for decades. In the years following the Castlewood tornado, researchers at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, conducted interviews with survivors of tornadoes across the plains. They asked a simple question: when you heard the warning, what did you do? The answers were not uniform. Some people took shelter immediately. Others looked outside first. Others called a family member. Others did nothing because they had heard warnings before and nothing had happened. The pattern that emerged is now called the confirmation bias loop. People who have experienced false alarms tend to seek evidence that the current warning is also a false alarm. They look for blue sky, they listen for silence, they check the radar on their phone. By the time they confirm the threat is real, the tornado is already upon them. This is what happened in Castlewood. The sheriff looked at the sky, he saw clear conditions. He trusted his eyes over the automated warning. And the automated warning was not backed by the one thing that could have overridden his doubt: a human voice from the NWS confirming the sighting. The NWS recognized this gap. In 2002, they began piloting a program called storm-based warnings. Instead of issuing warnings for entire counties, forecasters began drawing polygons around the specific storm cells. The idea was to reduce the area warned, thereby reducing false alarms. Fewer false alarms, the logic went, would increase public trust, but the human behavior problem was not solved by polygons alone. In 2007, a tornado struck Greensburg, Kansas. The NWS issued a tornado emergency, the highest level of warning, nearly 20 minutes before the tornado hit. The warning was specific. It said massive violent tornado and catastrophic damage. Yet 11 people died. Interviews later revealed that many residents did not hear the warning because they were asleep. Others heard it but did not believe it would hit their house. The pattern of Castlewood repeated itself, not in the specific details but in the human uncertainty that lies beneath every warning. By 2011, the NWS had adopted impact-based warnings statewide. These warnings included tags like considerable or catastrophic that were meant to convey the expected severity. But on May 22, 2011, a tornado tore through Joplin, Missouri. It killed 161 people. The NWS had issued a tornado warning 20 minutes before the tornado struck. The warning was impact-based. It said catastrophic. Yet many people did not take shelter. Some were at a high school graduation, some were in stores. Some believed the warning was for a different part of town. Some did not hear the sirens because they were indoors in a noisy environment. Joplin tornado became a turning point. The NWS realized that the warning message itself was only half the equation. The other half was how the message reached the public. In Joplin, many people relied on outdoor sirens, but sirens are designed for people outdoors. Those inside may not hear them, and even if they do, the siren does not tell them what to do or where to go. The siren is simply an alert. It is up to the individual to interpret the alert and decide on a course of action. In the aftermath of Joplin, the NWS partnered with social scientists to study how people receive and respond to warnings. They found that the most effective warnings are those that come from multiple sources. When people hear a warning on the radio, see it on television, receive it on their phone, and hear the siren outside, they are more likely to take action. But even multiple sources do not guarantee action if the person does not believe the threat is real. This is where the Castlewood case re-enters the discussion. The sheriff of Castlewood had a single source of information, the automated warning from the NWS via the CRS computer. He did not have radar imagery. He did not have a spotter report. He did not have a phone call from the NWS. The warning was a text on a screen, and when he looked outside and saw no storm, he dismissed it. The same psychology that led the people of Joplin to ignore a catastrophic warning was at work in Castlewood, but at the level of the emergency manager. The NWS responded to this by changing the way they communicate with local officials. Instead of relying solely on automated systems, they began to use phone calls for the most severe threats. The tornado emergency tag was meant to trigger a human conversation. Today, when a tornado emergency is issued, many NWS offices call the affected emergency managers directly, but even this system is not perfect. In 2019, a tornado struck Beauregard, Alabama, killing 23 people. The NWS issued a tornado emergency 18 minutes before the tornado hit. But the emergency manager in the county had recently retired, and the new emergency manager was not trained on the new phone alert system. The call was not answered. The sheriff did not activate the sirens until after the tornado had already passed through. Human behavior is not a simple variable. It depends on training, technology, personality, and circumstance. In Castlewood, the sheriff was an experienced law enforcement officer but not a trained meteorologist. He did not have a weather radio. He did not have a direct line to the NWS. He had a computer screen and a siren switch, and he had a deep, unspoken trust in his own ability to judge the weather by looking out the window. That trust, built over decades of living in a tornado-prone state, was his undoing. The science of human behavior has advanced since 20's rune. Social scientists now study how to communicate risk in ways that overcome this trust-based bias. They have found that warnings are more effective when they include specific, concrete language. Instead of saying a tornado is possible, the NWS now says a tornado is occurring or imminent. Instead of saying take shelter, they say go to the basement or interior room now. But even precise language can be ignored if the person does not believe the source is credible. In Castlewood, the source was the NWS, but the sheriff had no personal relationship with the forecaster who issued the warning. The message came through a machine. Trust in machines is different from trust in people. And when the machine is wrong 100 times out of 120, as the false alarm rate was in many areas, the machine loses its authority. The human brain then defaults to the most recent experience. For the sheriff, that experience was sunny skies. The Castlewood tornado was not the deadliest tornado in American history. It was not the most destructive, but it was a case study in the fragility of the warning chain. The chain had many links: the satellites, the radar, the computers, the forecasters, the communication lines, the sheriff, the siren, the public. Each link had a weakness. In Castlewood, the weakest link was the sheriff's decision to override the automated warning. That decision was not malicious, it was not reckless, it was human. And that is why the story still matters. Because every community that relies on a warning system must confront the same reality. The system is only as strong as the humans who operate it, and humans are not calculators, they are not computers. They are creatures of habit, instinct, and emotion. They hesitate, they doubt. They look for evidence that confirms what they already believe. And when the evidence is ambiguous, they often do nothing. In the 2 decades since the Castlewood tornado, the NWS has made great strides in reducing false alarms. The probability of detection has improved, the lead time has increased, but the false alarm rate for tornado warnings still hovers around 70%. That means that for every 3 warnings, only 1 tornado actually occurs. And the human brain, trained by evolution to respond to immediate threats, struggles to take a warning seriously when 90% of similar warnings in the past have been false. This is not a failure of the NWS. It is a failure of the human cognitive system, and changing that system requires not just better warnings but better education. Children in South Dakota now learn tornado safety in school. But a child who learns the warning tone in a classroom may forget it when they are an adult sitting in their living room on a summer evening, watching the sky darken. The Castlewood tornado also highlighted a specific gap in rural warning coverage. In many rural areas, the only warning system is the outdoor siren. But outdoor sirens are not designed to be heard indoors, especially in homes with air conditioning, televisions, or closed windows. In Castlewood, the siren was activated, but Arthur Miller did not hear it. He was in his house, likely with the television on, and the siren was too far away. The NWS recommends that every household have a NOAA weather radio, but in 2001, fewer than 10% of rural households had one. Even today, the number remains low in many areas. After the Castlewood tornado, the South Dakota Office of Emergency Management launched a campaign to distribute NOAA weather radios to every school and nursing home in the state. They also partnered with local television stations to run public service announcements about the importance of having multiple ways to receive warnings. But the campaign was limited by funding. In the end, only a fraction of the population received radios. And those who did often turned them off because of the frequent false alarms. The deeper question is whether any warning system can overcome the fundamental human tendency to underestimate risk. Psychologists call this optimism bias. It is the belief that bad things happen to other people, not to us. In Castlewood, Arthur Miller had lived through dozens of tornado warnings. He had never been hit. He believed he would not be hit. That belief was rational based on his experience, but it was wrong. The same optimism bias was at work in the sheriff. He had never activated the sirens based on an automated warning alone. He had always waited for confirmation. And his experience told him that waiting was safe. That experience, too, was rational. But it was wrong on June 24, 2001. In the years since, the NWS has tried to change that rationality by providing more context. Today, when a warning is issued, it includes the time the tornado is expected to reach specific landmarks. It includes the direction and speed of movement. It includes the expected damage level. These details are meant to override the optimism bias by making the threat feel concrete and imminent. But studies have shown that even detailed warnings do not always work. People who are in the path of a tornado often do not believe it will hit them until they see it. And by then, it is usually too late. The Castlewood tornado remains a lesson for emergency managers across the country. In every training seminar, the story is told. The sheriff is not named as a villain. He is named as a cautionary tale. The lesson is simple: never override an automated warning without clear evidence that the warning is false. But that lesson is easier to teach than to follow. Because in the moment when the sky is blue and the siren is silent, the temptation to trust your eyes is overwhelming. The town of Castlewood has moved on. The cemetery where Arthur Miller is buried is quiet. The plaque on his grave is weathered. The tornado scar on the landscape has healed. But the pattern that killed him has not been erased. It appears every time a warning is issued and ignored. It appears every time a person chooses to wait. It appears every time a community fails to build a culture of preparedness. The science of meteorology will continue to improve. Radars will become more sensitive. Forecast models will become more accurate. Lead times will lengthen. But the science of human behavior will always lag behind, because changing behavior is harder than changing technology. And that is the final uncomfortable truth of the Castlewood tornado. The system worked. The warning was issued, but the system was human, and humans are not perfect. The last mile of every warning is the distance between a message and a life. In Castlewood, that distance was measured in seconds, but it was also measured in trust, in habit, in instinct, and in the stubborn belief that the worst will not happen. And until that belief is overcome, the gap between warning and action will remain.